LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 with Jason Horsley discussing his book Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation. In this second session we delve further into the depths that lie beneath the surface of culture and society, seething with secret agendas, mind control and mass manipulation. Its hidden realms may hold secret knowledge for transformation and transcendence on paths to enlightenment or oblivion. Where physics meets psyche, forces seen and unseen, some of them human, conspire toward ends which often does not appear beyond conscious comprehension. A quest for wholeness, communion with the Creator, the truth of the ultimate nature of reality, or something far more mysterious, we simply cannot say, but the questions remain. What is the agenda? Who or what are they? And what part do we play? Hello and welcome, Jason, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Oh, thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Today, Jason, we're going to be doing a follow-up chat to one that we did a few months back, and it concerns your book, Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation. Now, for listeners who haven't read the book, I'd urge them to do so, but for our purposes, perhaps have a listen to that aforementioned previous chat that we did, UFOs, Trauma and Hacking the Human Psyche, which they can find at LegalizeFreedom.com. If they just put your name, for example, into the search box, they can find that. They may also be interested in the talks we did about Vice of Kings, a more recent book of yours, and again, you can find those at LegalizeFreedom.com. Before we get started today, just give listeners a little bit of information about your background and work in general.
Well, writer, born in England, born in Yorkshire, lifelong interest in films, which sort of transformed in my 20s into a abiding interest in occultism, shamanism, paranoid awareness, social engineering, conspiracies, and so I've kind of been fusing the three together, like my interest in culture, particularly popular culture, my interest in spirituality, and I would say its kind of evil twin, occultism, and my interest in deep state, parapolitical, social engineering agendas and whatnot. They all seem quite to flow seamlessly into one another in my life and experience, but I've been trying to present that through a series of books that I've been writing for the last 20 years.
Well, when we last spoke, as I say, which was about Prisoner of Infinity and things spinning off from that, I hadn't even completed the book at that point, because there was just basically so much to it, so much to think about, so many points that I had to sort of put it down and give some time to thought and to thought and reflection. When I was writing some notes, when I came back to complete the book, and I was trying to think, what is, for me, what is this book about? What is it saying to me? What is it communicating to me? And I had this phrase, which was agendas or the agenda. If someone asked you briefly, oh, so Jason, Prisoner of Infinity, what's that about? How do you describe the book?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do get that question sometimes in the thrift store that I work, because we have my books on display, and occasionally somebody asks me to explain it, or indeed on podcasts and whatnot, and I tend to get a brain seizure. it's really hard to sum up. I mean, that's the point of your question, isn't it? So it will depend on the moment, really. Try and get a sense of what the person is interested in. I mean, clearly there's a superficial answer, which is it's about alien abductions and government mind control and the intersection between those two things. And I say that's superficial, obviously. I mean, that's a fairly profound question, or a very profound question, isn't it? Socio-politically speaking and culturally. But I would still say it's superficial as compared to what I'm really attempting in that book, which is to understand the human psyche and the way that it interfaces with society and culture. And I mean, I paused there because I wasn't sure whether to say just reality, because I think in our pure state, the psyche is supposed to just interface directly with reality through the body. So that would just be nature. But of course we're in a heavily socialized time in history, or human beings are increasingly socialized. And I see that kind of socialization process as something that has got out of hand, or has become basically malign or destructive to the psyche. And so my books are all about that in different ways, but none more than Prisoner of Infinity, I think. And one way I would sum up the nature of this agenda, which can be extended to the whole of society rather than localized conspiracies. I think there's a much larger agenda, which is kind of collective unconscious drive as a result of trauma. And the way I sum that up is the disembodiment agenda, that we're being pushed and at the same time unconsciously driving ourselves into more and more disembodied or less and less embodied states of being. So there's increasing schism between the psyche or the soul and the body, and I think that is compatible with more profane socio-political agendas, also known as conspiracies, to strip us of and prevent us from ever attaining any kind of autonomy or wholeness, which of course makes us that much easier to control and manage.
All my life, I've been trying in different ways, consciously and unconsciously, to understand or reality, to see more clearly. And I had this instinctual feeling very early on that the unseen was a bigger component than the seen, as it were, as far as we are concerned. And there's a certain frustration. I don't like to use that word. I don't ever like to describe myself as frustrated, but a certain yearning for something that most of us can't quite articulate, even if we come to that conclusion. We don't really know what it is that we're not having or not getting or not where we're not going. And this overlaps, and I resonated with some of the points you made in your book about certain agendas and groups and individuals who maybe in their own way are trying to achieve certain things, a certain type of gnosis or understanding, or to transcend what appears to be our very limited senses and abilities and understanding. One phrase that I actually used towards the end of our last chat, I don't think we recorded this, but when I was talking about, oh look, I'm going to have to get back to you when I finish the book, I said, maybe next time we can talk about the blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. And the Stormers of Heaven was a phrase that I pulled from your book. So in the context of what I've just said and what agenda or agendas, perhaps explain who or what you mean. I know this is a huge question, but just in some kind of digestible way, what you mean, what that phrase is denoting.
Sure, that comes from the Gospel. Can't remember which one. It might be John. In terms of a warning about those who would storm heaven, which means taking heaven by violence, trying to enter paradise, which we could say is a metaphor or a religious symbol for wholeness, communion with our soul, completeness, oneness with God, etc. And the Gospel refers to those who will attempt to do this through violence, which by definition is impossible, but it won't stop them from trying. And in Prisoner of Infinity, I mean, I came upon that was the inception of the book, as it turned out. that concept of storming heaven in relation to this piece by Jeffrey Kripal, The Traumatic Secret, about George Bataille and Whitley Strieber, and his thesis that it is possible that some forms of trauma might lead to enlightenment, and then he extends it even using the parallel of the Hadron Collider and how these scientists, these scientific programs are attempting to attain a complete understanding of nature and of reality through smashing atoms together and to see what they're made of. So this idea of using violence to get to the deepest truth about existence is presented by Kripal as a literal fact scientifically, but also a metaphorical example. I mean, he uses it as a metaphor for this idea he has about storming heaven or attaining enlightenment through trauma. Now, to be fair to Kripal, he's not overtly proposing that we attempt to attain enlightenment by being traumatized, or we attempt to enlighten others by traumatizing them. But he is making a direct correlation between this idea, this spiritual and metaphysical idea of enlightenment through trauma, with the Hadron Collider, which of course is an example of the use of the will, in deliberate programs and agendas trying to bring about results. And then he juxtaposes that with Whitley Strieber, who himself has claimed to have been a victim of MKUltra style mind control programs as a child, to have been severely traumatized, and to have had his mirror of expectation, as he puts it, shattered because of this psychic fracking, and to have accessed the higher reality in which he encountered these visitors that he writes about, these supposed non-human or ultra-human beings, or whatever, however we're going to try and describe them. So Kripal uses that then as a apparently real-world example of how, because of Strieber's trauma, he attained a kind of enlightenment, as in access to this higher reality, or what you refer to as the invisible realms. So I do believe that there is an ongoing belief and philosophy, or a long-standing belief and philosophy, that corresponds with an ongoing, we could say, secret program. We wouldn't have to reduce it to that, the more nuts and bolt paranoid perspective, because it would also include cultural movements and philosophies such as Georges Bataille and the surrealists' attempt to fuse dream reality with waking reality, Castaneda's books about sorcery, Crowley. There's occultism in general, I would say, about the will to power, using the will to attain knowledge that will then lead to power, which is a kind of, I think that there's a conflation between two things here. One is knowledge-based power, and the other is enlightenment. And first of all, I don't think those two are related. And I think that this would relate, bring it back to the biblical source thing, the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament was this attempt of human beings to reach the realm of the gods through will, through building this great machine, or this great tower. And of course, God cast them down and put a curse on us, the Babel, so that we wouldn't even be able to communicate with one another. So we felt lower than we had been before we attempted to attain heaven, because we were using these illegitimate methods. And that can be taken as metaphorical, of course. It could also be taken as literal, and lots of people do, but I think I tend to stay in the realm of the psychological, and which is, it corresponds with physical and literal actual reality, but it begins with a deeper, subtler internal reality, and this is the reality of the psyche, and what happens when we're traumatized, and how a traumatic imprint, which is like an implant, which is like a program in a certain sense, like trauma, you could say, creates a viral program in the psyche by splitting it and turning it against itself. And that one of the results of this, and I argue in Prisoner of Infinity this has been consciously used, is to imbue a traumatized psyche with a pathological drive to attain power, because of the experience of powerlessness that was created by the trauma, by the abuse, the unbearable experience of being powerless, it causes a fragmentation in which you could say, to simplify it, you could say there are two aspects. One is the powerless, traumatized part, and that gets pushed down into amnesia, into forgetting the trauma itself. And then what's left is this superegoic part that is, on the one hand, protecting the total person or awareness from the memory or the experience of powerlessness and trauma. On the other hand, is pathologically driven to attain power because of that formative experience of powerlessness. And that, I'd say, is the trauma genesis of the Heavensstormer. That they're so heavily impacted by some formative trauma, and that loss of paradise, that splitting off of the psyche from the body and even from itself, that desperate yearning, as you put it, does turn into an overwhelming frustration and even rage that then gets sublimated and channeled into so-called spiritual practice. I would say pseudo-spiritual practices, which are much more congruent with what we know of as occultism, as well as more profane things, scientism and whatnot, and seeking, fame and success in the world. It clearly doesn't lead to wholeness. It just perpetuates the wound by constantly trying to attain a pseudo kind of wholeness rather than the true heaven, which can only be accessed through surrender. Storming is the opposite of surrender. So it's a Luciferian drive, essentially, which is Milton's famous Paradise Lost, where he has Lucifer declaring that it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That would be the unconscious or the hidden battle cry of the Heavensstormer.
I wonder if there's any sort of Promethean overtones to it as well.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. So as a result, my points may not feel like they're proceeding directly from the previous one, but that's right. That's the nature of it, and that's what the book did to my thinking and to my brain. But I mean, as far as Hadron Collider is concerned, I've called that the world's largest cathedral, and not without reason. We always seem to be summed up best in the violence of that place. We always seem to be looking outside of ourselves, don't we, for whatever it is we're looking for. Looking for it in the world, and in things, and even in others. The answers are always somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, that's even in the Christian idea of heaven as it's become literalized as a place. And even, this intersects, and as I recount or try and lay out in part 2 of Prisoner of Infinity, there's a superimposition in modern times, postmodern times, of scientism, transhumanism, and the quest to conquer space onto the ancient belief in heaven. That just shows how there's been a steady progression of a literalization of a metaphorical reality or truth, which corresponds with an exteriorization, as you say, of looking more and more outside of oneself for a place or a thing that is going to provide the peace that we're seeking. And of course that's why I say by definition it doesn't work. Storming heaven itself, you're already starting from the erroneous assumption that heaven is some place with gates that have to be stormed, that's something outside of oneself, as opposed to what Devacharna calls the journey of zero distance. It's our natural state that we've been cut off from through this trauma. And because of that split, I think there's a part of us which is exteriorized, which hasn't been able to land or dwell in the body, because the trauma has pushed our consciousness out of the body because of the unbearable pain and the toxins that were put in the body by the trauma. Part of our awareness, and even the primary part, our mental awareness, if you will, our conscious awareness, has exteriorized. It's outside of our body, not literally in the sense that we're still seeing through the body, the senses and so on, but our awareness is in our mind. If you think about it, it's in our thoughts rather than in our body. We're generally not aware of what's going on in our body. We're not aware of our heart beating or our breathing or our sensations generally, unless they become, extreme cold or heat or pain or something. Our awareness is generally on our thinking and our emotions. And so where are they located? Well, they may actually be located in the body, but we're not referring to the body. We're referring more to mental images and associations, memories and so on. So I'd say that this mind self that's created through trauma is in a certain sense perhaps literally outside of the body, maybe energetically in some way that we can't see with our senses. And so because we've exteriorized through trauma, we then have more and more of these mental or conceptual constructs which are external to ourselves, that we're looking outside of our bodies rather than inside of our bodies for heaven. But heaven is within. I mean, that's even in the gospel, isn't it? The kingdom is within us.
Yes. Now, in pop psychology, the concept of transformation through trauma is quite common these days. And we can all think of people who've maybe gone through some terrible event, bereavement or addiction or something that's happened in their life that ultimately they feel has opened them up into a better and wider reality at the end of it all. Sort of, I wasn't really living, and this terrible thing happened to me, but it opened my eyes, and when I was able to move through this trauma and come out of it, more a better person, more aware, more complete, whatever it happens to be. But in the context that we're talking about, you make the point in the book, does it simply look like enlightenment?
And clearly one has to take that on a case-by-case basis, because I'm not arguing against the possibility that one can heal one's trauma, and by doing so one attains a wisdom that one perhaps would not have had if one hadn't been traumatized. But that's very different than thinking that trauma itself somehow leads to enlightenment. It's the integration of trauma that would be a return to wholeness. And I think that is relatively rare as compared to, well, I guess there's two alternatives that are much more common. One is simply shut it away, don't go there, it's the past, let sleeping dogs lie, there's nothing to be gained by self-examination or navel gazing or any of that. That's pretty common, is that viewpoint, is that really it's best not to think about it. It was a terrible thing, so just move on. And you will find that if you ever try and explore your own, not you personally, but anyone, personal family abuse or trauma, whatever there might be in one's past, one will find generally one will encounter a lot of resistance from family members who will say exactly that. Why are you digging up the past? Why are you blaming your parents or whatever it is, when of course it doesn't have to be that at all. Well, maybe digging up the past part is true, but it doesn't have to involve any kind of blame or recrimination or regret. It's simply a desire to become whole, and by allowing one's awareness to go where it has been prevented from going. But anyway, the other way that you refer to, that people tend to, I think, misunderstand trauma or have a false relationship with it, is that they discover through trauma the benefits of dissociation, if you will. As in, dissociation is a means to deal with trauma, but it's also a means to escape reality and to enter into fantasy. I mean, that's what dissociation allows for. I won't say that it is, because I think dissociation in its simplest term is simply you disassociate from what is happening in the moment because it's unbearable. So it provides a relief. But one can disassociate consciously, and I mean, this is most common in when somebody has an out-of-body experience, a person being raped, say, they might experience themselves actually out of their body looking down at the rape as it's occurring. That would be a very literal kind of disassociation. But in that experience, one is at least aware that it's still happening and that one has dissociated. So one can then, in theory, I've not had this experience, one can choose to return to the experience whenever one feels ready. On the other hand, to use this example, one could say, oh, I've disassociated, something terrible is happening to my body, but I'm not in it anymore, so I can just fly off to other planets and hang out with aliens like Whitley, and I don't ever have to come back to my body again, or at least I certainly don't have to come back until this terrible thing is over, and I won't have any memory of it because I wasn't there when it happened. And in the meantime, I've discovered this amazing power to exteriorize, as in to astral project, whatever, if we're going to take it literally, but to dissociate in such a way that I can completely forget about the physical, this lived reality, and go off into these other realms, which may or may not be real, psychic and or fantasy. Right? How do we know which is which? There's clearly a spectrum there, like when we dream at night, sometimes it seems real, and sometimes we know it's just brain, stuff being worked out, because some people would say that it all is, but in my experience there definitely is. There are dreams that do correlate with reality per se. So anyway, I think that's what Kripal's talking about and what you're referring to as misuse of trauma and the pseudo-enlightenment, which is traditionally in the East that was about siddhis, as in psychic abilities. And I'm absolutely sure that trauma can, because it splits the psyche, you could say that it shatters or it punctures a natural shield that we have that's part of the psyche that protects us from psychic phenomena, from being too exposed and too vulnerable to these psychic forces, whatever they are. And so if that gets damaged through trauma, then suddenly we may have access to those psychic realms, including entities and so on, and therefore we become more vulnerable, but we also become more powerful, in quotes. I mean, maybe it's a true sort of power, but definitely a double-edged sword, and not to be mistaken with enlightenment, which correlates with wholeness, with a natural state. And I think there's a natural psychism which is similar to what animals have, like bodily, we are in tune with what's going on in the invisible realms, but that's very different from actually splitting off from the body and kind of joining the invisible realms, and then becoming subject to them. And that's probably, the heaven stormers, they may well feel they succeed in some way. They may be able to enter Bardo realms, into subjective psychic realms, or even create their own through these cities, and have a relative, eternity in some counterfeit heaven where they get to rule, but it's actually hell in disguise.
Well, if some victims of trauma feel that they have inadvertently gained access to some sort of hidden realm, you so seem to also be saying that there's a dimension that certain aspects of the violence that we spoke about earlier, whether it's atom smashers, certain occult practices, child abuse, that certain groups, individuals, whatever, trying to somehow actively exploit those to gain access to hidden realms, that can be part of the a process.
Well, yeah, I do believe that, but it's very difficult to sum it up because there are different ways of looking at it and understanding it, and it's clearly, by definition, it's not something that we have much direct experience of unless we happen to be unfortunate enough to be participating in those practices or rituals or victims of it. Now, if we're victims of that, we might not remember it. In my case, I don't know to what extent I was. But even there, we're getting into a strange twilight realm of a spectrum of society and culture in which these kind of practices, although on the one hand they can be reduced, if you like, to specific agendas, times in history, individuals, victims, and so on, and then they are made to look like something separate from our experience and separate from society at large. I think that essentially society and culture as we know it is the result of these practices. So then that makes it impossible really to separate out. And so very, very hard to talk about. And I feel as I've just been talking around your question there because it was such a big one. Essentially, you were saying that the principles that we're talking about today can be applied consciously. And so, the simple answer to that is yeah, for sure. I mean, if you and I can talk about it with some rudimentary understanding, it's impossible not to imagine that there aren't people with a much deeper understanding, and as with the Hadron Collider, although much more profoundly, without any kind of ethical checks and bounds to prevent them from, applying that knowledge destructively to their own advantage. So, I do write about these programs, including MK Ultra and so on, but I always try to bring it back to, two things. One, my own personal direct experience, which hopefully corresponds with yours, with other people, so they can relate. And the other thing is culture at large, as in what we know and what we all agree about culture, which isn't necessarily the same, what we think we know about society and culture. Because that's the reference point. Unlike, let's say, quote, conspiracy theories, unquote, there's a lot of room for speculation by definition. These are theories. There's definitely a realm of historical fact and then shared culture that we all kind of agree on, even if I think we need to question that. So I try to keep it within the realms that we're all familiar with. And even if we're not conscious, like even if we're prevented from really recognizing our familiarity through amnesia and so on and so forth. But I would say we're all familiar with trauma. We're all familiar now with the lexicon or the rhetoric of sexual abuse, even if we don't have direct experience, although I'd say that's unlikely, because I'd say most people now probably know somebody who's a victim of sexual abuse and know it. I mean, we all definitely know loads of people who are, but they might not talk about it. But I'd say most people know somebody who talks about it at this point. I certainly know dozens of people at this point. And there's a growing understanding about what sexual abuse is and how sexual predators operate. So what I was trying to get to here, taking me a while, was that even if you just look at that, how a sexual predator, male or female, use the effects of trauma to control their victim and to protect themselves, to terrorize the victim, to prevent the victim from speaking about it, even to prevent the victim from remembering it, to possess the victim, figuratively speaking, and have control over them, to get them to do their bidding, and so on, right? So I think it's much easier if we look at the personal and the individual, and then from there we can start to extrapolate and or even juxtapose it with what we see in the culture, which is what I've done in my recent books. Like, the culture is just imbued with all of these signifiers, such as heaven storming and the will to power and so on. Then what's called memes, right? There are trends, there are cultural trends, beliefs that are propagated and that are instilled in us from childhood, because we can see them in the childhood media as well, children's media. Those two things can be juxtaposed quite persuasively, I think. That's why I come back to Jimmy Savile so often. We know about what Jimmy Savile did. He was like a one-man MK Ultra, if you will, and not that he was working alone. And he was a children's entertainer. Right? So it's kind of all embodied in that one cultural boogeyman who was once a cultural hero.
Yeah, well, we talked about Savile before, so I won't really backtrack on that. Simply for me to repeat for the benefit of listeners who haven't checked out any of our previous interviews, it's just simply that with Savile, my situation growing up in the 1970s, in his most prolific period, however you want to use the word prolific, I always just thought on a simplistic, childish level, what is this guy's talent? Why is this kind of freakish old dude on TV. Because normally I was used to seeing, good-looking guys and girls on TV. The sort of usual people that get selected, possibly more for their looks than their talent. But he seemed to have neither, and it always mystified me. But I always felt there was something creepy about the guy. Well, there just self-evidently was to me. But again, whether consciously or unconsciously, we all collectively just denied what was in front of our own eyes.
Well, certainly, and it's hindsight that's 2020, isn't it? Because I don't know, I can't say for sure what I thought about Jimmy Savile at the time, but he certainly was successful with Jim Will Fix It, and part of the success of Jim Will Fix It was that all these kids wanted to be on the show, so they clearly didn't think he was creepy at a conscious level. They wanted to sit on his lap, so that's, there's something deeply creepy in that, is that the sexual predator somehow can summon enough charisma, which is also, as I write, a side effect of trauma, I believe. It's a siddhi. Charisma is a siddhi, a power, to spellbind his victims or her victims.
Yeah, I like to call it, charisma I always think of as a positive thing, but maybe, I don't know, was enchantment a better word to fit in with that spellbinding ability? The ability to sort of, to a bit like, the exploit in Star Wars with the Force, these are not the droids you're looking for. It's like, forget the evidence of your senses. It is not like that. It is how I say.
Yeah. But that is charisma. Charisma anthropologically, charisma is a shamanic power that involves weather control, and it's very curious how they use charisma anthropologically. And I think there's definitely a reason for that. It corresponds with our reality, but the whole of our culture has come about through trauma genesis, congruent with the traumas that are being generated in us psychically in the culture that creates, and the way that our dissociation corresponds with cultural fantasies and so on and so forth. And so anyway, within that context of a trauma generated culture, and a culture that generates trauma, so a trauma genetic culture, charisma, we just think of charisma as something that lucky people have, something that celebrities have, and we don't think consciously we're being enchanted here, that glamour magic is work, i.e. we're being made to ignore evidence that tells us something that this individual doesn't want us to know, primarily that they're a sociopath. I do think that probably most celebrities, like most politicians and most cultural leaders, are sociopaths. I don't want to oversimplify that, because I know there's a lot of people who do believe that now, and they probably don't have the basis for believing it. I would say I have uncovered enough evidence in my own life and in my own researches to believe it, and I'd recommend the reader, rather than just taking me at my word, to refer to that, because it is important, if one is going to have beliefs, to really base them on knowledge. I don't want to oversimplify that, but I'm trying to illustrate a point about charisma, that if somebody has a very powerful charisma, one of the effects of that might be that they, like Ted Bundy, they could conceal completely from our awareness their malevolent character, and we would just think they were lovely, wonderful people.
You've written in all of this also extensively about your own personal experience and family background. You were mentioning earlier that you knew, to some extent, dozens of people who'd been victims of abuse of whatever kind, and you're sort of saying that, we all know someone. Just on a personal note, I don't think I do. Now, there's one person who used to be in my life who I did wonder whether they were a victim of sexual abuse, but the information I had to go on just simply said there was something bad, something dark in their past that was being pushed down, and don't go there. But I didn't have, any more information to come to a firm conclusion. So is it a case that probably I have met lots of people in whatever context who have been victims of abuse? Because this relates to a question we asked in a previous interview, like how deep does the rabbit hole go? Particularly in Vice of Kings, you prompt us to think about this. How widespread are networks of abuse, how many people are unspoken victims of organised abuse, and on and on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, to a large extent, the signals we get from the world correspond with the signals we transmit. So, clearly, as a counterpoint to your own case, because I talk openly about sexual abuse, organised or otherwise, including my own, I both attract a lot of people who are victims of it and who want to talk to me about it. Plus, I would encourage people who already know me to speak about it, because I'm speaking about it. Like, if you were to go around, if you yourself had a memory of being sexually abused and it was something that you talked openly about, I'm sure that you would find more people that you know would say, oh,
yes,
well, as long as we're talking about this, right? They're not simply going to bring it up. They're going to need a context, and this is assuming that they remember it, which of course is a whole other question. How many people are walking around carrying, suppressed memories of abuse? And I don't really want to get into that right now, because that's a big unknown. But if we just stay with this, how many people who do have some memory are talking about it, or even some suspicion, let's say, that really depends on the right space. I mean, it's the safe space, and even if it's just safe enough, I mean, people who come into my thrift store talk about it, and the thrift store is a public space, so it's not a traditionally or conventionally safe space like a therapist's office. But something about, I mean, in fact, my wife and I run it. My wife talks openly not about her sexual abuse, but about sexual abuse as a subject. I've got books about it on display. Most people don't, I think, know what's in those books, and they don't listen to my podcast or anything. So and I don't talk about it. So it's more mysterious. People feel some kind of affinity. I mean, I think there was an experiment that was done. I can't cite, the name or the date or anything, but with a large room with a large number of people there, and they were asked to mingle randomly, and it was observed afterwards over time that those who had suffered certain kinds of it wasn't just about sexual abuse, it was about their general history. But anyway, they would group together. So in this case, the example, specifically, it would be victims of a certain kind of sexual abuse would end up grouping together with victims of a similar kind of sexual abuse without knowing it and without talking about it. The body language communicated. So that's, 90% of what we communicate is non-verbal anyway. And, the whole premise about sexual abuse and trauma is that it goes in the body and it's carried in the body. So very much, this is something that, to mention Dave O'Shaughnessy again, who I've been working with quite a lot and learning a lot from a more direct sort of experiential place about trauma. He talks about this, how our unconscious mannerisms are our body's attempt to tell the story or to reveal the secrets of our past. So clearly that would be primarily trauma, or, whatever end of the spectrum, or wherever it is on the spectrum. We've all been traumatized to some degree or another. Now, it's not always sexual, it's not always physical, it can be emotional and mental, but there are still degrees of trauma, and to the extent that they don't get integrated or dissolved or healed, they stay in the body. And so then our way of speaking, our way of talking, our way of moving, our way of being in the world is constantly communicating this. Like, we're trying to tell our story unconsciously. So, yeah, that's the long answer. Yeah, the other thing is perhaps you don't want to know. That's also possible. You don't really want to talk about those things and don't want to hear about those things, and so you signal that. That's also possible.
This is true, and we don't like to think of ourselves as attracting or repelling attracting things we don't want or repelling things that we do want, but of course it happens. Now, you mentioned MK Ultra. If people who don't know what that is, just put it into your favorite search engine, and you can find out about that secret intelligence agency program that ran for many years. In terms of the aforementioned access to hidden realms, access to mind at large, and the role of, occult groups and shadowy intelligence agencies and governmental and non-governmental organizations in all of this, which is obviously is massive. Tying it in with what you said earlier about Tower of Babel and Babel, in fact, inhibited communication, you get the feeling that in terms of occult knowledge, looking beyond the hidden realms, that there's a, as far as most of us are concerned, the great unwashed, the mass of the public, it's like coming from wherever it is, on high, from beyond. It's like, nothing for you here, stay away, this isn't for you, and in fact there's nothing to it anyway, so you're wasting your time. But evidence such as, the activities at the Hadron Collider seem to suggest that some of these same people think otherwise. So going along with this feeling of exclusion, like, for the likes of you and me, it's like, stay away, there also seems to be the feeling that we're somehow needed in terms of some of these agendas. We have to be brought along for the ride in some way. So it's like, we don't want, this knowledge isn't for you, but actually we have to coerce you into involvement somehow, because that's part of the process as well.
Well, I think there's a bit of reverse psychology going on there, because I think the occult, so-called, first of all, I think it's a misnomer. Nothing is hidden. It's just split off from our awareness. We are avoiding something, keeping something out of awareness because it's threatening or painful. So that's very different from something being hidden. However, I think the idea of the occult, that something is hidden and that we have to somehow find it and get it, like a buried treasure, is very powerful. And I think that idea has been generated and used as a form of control. If you imagine a group or a clique that does have some certain knowledge that it uses, that applies to control people, it's important that it keeps that knowledge to itself, but it can also use that idea that it possesses hidden knowledge or occult power as a means of controlling people itself, because they will then look to this group or this imagined power as something that is they don't have and therefore is over them, that makes them inferior and powerless before, and B, as something they want. So then they're both kind of beholden to this group, if you will, and feel inferior to it because they're made aware that it knows something that we don't. I'll turn it into the first person now. And B, we want access to that group. We want to become part of it. And that makes us easier to control also, if you think about it. It's not just fear, but it's also desire. Because we're not just afraid of the repercussions of being on the wrong side of that group because it can crush us with its occult knowledge. We also want to curry its favor because we want to try and gain access to that world. So we're doubly damned, if you will. We're doubly controlled. We're not only are we going to avoid offending it, we're actually going to be sucking up to the powers that be. And that we can definitely see that in our world. And I think that occult knowledge has been used this way, as in there's this whole idea about the secrets of the occult and whatnot, but the internet and bookstores are flooded with information that's supposedly secret, and people are lapping it up. Like they don't really, and that's true with conspiracy theory. Like all this stuff out there, David Icke or Alex Jones supposedly revealing the truth about these secret conspiracies. Well, they're not, and how powerful and effective they are at controlling us. Well, they haven't been very effective about keeping it secret, have they? And yet, so there's something very contradictory in that, and that somehow we've been conditioned not to notice, I'd say.
Is there also an element of, the power of the abuser, of something being explicit, open, and hidden in plain sight, as it were. You see this sometimes in sort of master-slave relationship. It's like, yes, I'm openly and explicitly doing this to you. What are you going to do about it? Nobody, other people can see this. They're not going to do anything. Your cries for help will go unheeded, as it were. I don't know if there's a dimension of that, which is a little bit like magic in itself. It's like say it and it will be so sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. And I think it's probably related to what I was trying to say, which is that, because what you're describing there is to disempower someone. You've already stripped them of power by controlling and abusing them, but then, like Jimmy Savile, you're going to joke and brag about it in front of them to show that nobody cares and there's nothing you can do about it, and that this person is so powerful they don't even have to conceal it. And insofar as, you're extending it to them sort of bragging about things that you weren't even aware were being done to you. So now you are, what are you going to do about it? Well, if the answer is nothing, which it generally is, because they're not giving you, they may be giving you some profound occult so-called information, but they're not telling you how to apply it or what to do about it, then chances are, you won't do anything about it. So then that not doing in and of itself is a consent. I think there is something in that, the tradition of the vampire as well, that has to be invited over the threshold. So first of all, the vampire has to knock. It's a bit confusing because in some vampire stories he just slips in through the window and stuff, so I'm not sure, it's not very consistent there. But anyway, there is that idea that the vampire has to knock and has to be invited in. I think that's a symbolic account of what we're talking about here, which is, to a certain extent, these powers, these forces, these individuals need our consent. The other thing that I was saying I think corresponds with here, which is more new to me, which is to do with, if you give people knowledge without them having earned it, basically if you just tell them this is the nature of what's going on in the world, or what we're doing to you, and with conspiracy theory and occultism also, those two things tend to be one thing, what's going on in the world, and also what we're victims of. If you give people that knowledge without them having done the necessary procedure to discover it themselves, they're just being given it, it's actually disempowering, because it strips them of the opportunity to really discover something and to have a knowledge that's grounded in their own insight, experience, research, deduction, and so on. So it will be true knowledge. Knowledge that's simply given or imparted isn't true knowledge, because we haven't come upon it through our own resources, through our own autonomous choices. We've just had it thrust upon us. This is a Promethean thing again. So I think, this is something I'm only just beginning to realize about how much information out there. Because I've often wondered, what is it about David Icke or Alex Jones that I don't like besides their method of delivery? Because a lot of the information I find in my own research can be confirmed, not the reptilians obviously, but a lot of it seems like good information, but it's the way it's imparted. So what is that? And I've just begun to realize that it's to do with this. It's that people who are given knowledge willy-nilly like that, they feel as though it's empowering them, but actually, because it's overwhelming, they don't know how they came about it. It was just some guy who told them. They can't confirm or validate it. They can't apply it, and they can't put it in the context of their own personal experience, because they didn't come across it through personal experience. They just came across it on the internet. Now, that is a spectrum, because I wrote Vice of Kings, I was researching a lot on the internet, but and Prisoner of Infinity, but I was constantly referring back to my own family history and my own personal experience of trauma and my own understanding of psychology, and constantly trying to ground it in that context, precisely in order to neutralize this effect that I'm talking about, that knowledge that is kept hidden but then revealed in this way. It's like a magician's trick or something. It's a way You disempower people by taking the knowledge away from them and by letting them know that they don't know something. But then you give it to them, and that disempowers them further. Like it's very, very cunning and sophisticated, I think, the way it's done. But I'm only just beginning to see this now.
The second part of this conversation will be available soon on legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom, and you can spell legalize with an S or a Z.